Welcome to this coding tutorial. Today we are going to start with air gapping a Kubernetes cluster or an OpenShift cluster. And the way we're going to start doing that is by using a virtual private cloud and isolate our Kubernetes cluster within the virtual private cloud. Now, this is very easy to do on IBM Cloud, so that's what I'm going to use here as the platform to demonstrate this. It's one of the foundational steps in securing your cluster, and hence it's one of the first steps to make sure you're compliant with security, just to block off that external traffic from outside of the network and where your cluster is located. So let's dive right in. So we can, first of all, we can go to the lab instructions by going to medium.com at Remko dev, and Remko dev is spelled REMKOHDEV. Yeah, so we can go to medium.com/@Remko dev, REMKOHDEV. And that will load my personal tutorial listings here on Medium. And we're just taking the air gap and secure a Kubernetes cluster with VPC Gen2 article. Now, if, in the meantime, when you're listening or watching this tutorial later, you can scroll down a bit maybe if I added other tutorials. There's other tutorials here already, like how to mount an object storage as if it's a local file system on your local machine. Here's like how open source projects are driving DevOps and security. Let's see what else we got. A picture of myself, hello. How to deploy to OpenShift cluster using straight up containers and using the built-in pipelines in OpenShift. So there's a lot of like fun little tutorials here. Here's one on storage, etc. So let's start with the topic of today, however, which is how to secure a Kubernetes cluster using virtual private cloud. So we'll enter into the tutorial here, and we'll scroll down a little bit past these descriptions. What we're going to need for the tutorial today is a IBM Cloud account, because that's where we're going to create all our resources on. It's a free cloud account. For this particular tutorial, if you do not have access to the pay-as-you-go services, you need to add your credit card to create a pay-as-you-go account. It's still free, so nothing will be charged except for, I believe it's $1 to validate your credit card, and then it's going to be restituted. But it's a free pay-as-you-go account, and that way you'll be able to use like over 115 cloud services, amongst which these virtual private cloud services. So that's what you need to do first. Here, if you go to cloud.ibm.com, you have to log in. If you're not logged in, if you do not have an account, create an account first. You'll be sent a verification email. You have to confirm it with the code and fill out the rest of the information, and then you'll have a free IBM Cloud account. You can, I believe it's, if I go to ibm.github.io workshop setup, there is some instructions here about upgrading your IBM Cloud accounts. You can go to account settings, so manage account settings, and then the instructions are to go to the account upgrade. I already upgraded. Or was it under billing and usage? Let me check. No, it's under account/settings. So that's where we were before. Sorry, I'm frantically clicking around a little bit here. Account, and then account settings. There it is. I overlooked it the first time we went there. So manage account settings right there on the left side. And then I already upgraded to my account. You see here pay-as-you-go. If you do not have a pay-as-you-go account yet, you can, oh, where's the instructions? You will see browse back to the instructions, you will see here under account upgrade a option to add your credit card, and that will upgrade it, but its address is still free, so no worries. And then here's a sub selection actually of some of the services that are listed. It's quite a lot of fun services. You'll get quiet to intermediate, some even advanced levels of education by using this. The other thing that we need is a client terminal environment. So I'm using a client terminal with some pre-installed tooling so that everybody can use same tooling. So that way I know that the tutorial will guarantee work if you follow the instructions. And you can use the one that I use here at labs.cognitiveclass.ai. You'll get a little notification here that says this is for learning purposes. I understand. And I can log in with my IBM Cloud account actually, or one of these other federated searches. If I click Cognitive Class button, at the bottom is an IBM ID button. The first time you might have to create an account when you, and you can use the IBM Cloud account there as well. And if I make the font size a little bit smaller, you'll see here the part that we'll use here is these Thaya environments on the right side. And Thaya is an open source Visual Studio browser-based IDE. So if I use, let's see, the first one with Docker engine installed, the other one is practically the same. The difference is that it comes to support courses at the Cognitive Class, but we're not using the courses at the Cognitive Class, so we're just using the client terminal environment. This will take an environment because this will take a while because the image for Thaya is being downloaded, pulled, and deployed, and the tooling is being installed amongst others. Thaya. I'm gonna push this out of my browser, and then I'm going to split my screen in two for following along easily. So that way we have my instructions on the left side, and I'll have the client terminal on the right side. Yeah, so if I go back here, this is my cloud.ibm.com. So if I go back to IBM Cloud, you'll see this is my dashboard. If I scroll down a little bit to this welcome page with view all resources. And currently I have no resources on this account. I sort of emptied out, cleared it out for this tutorial. So let's scroll down a little bit for the setup. This has all the same instructions as I just went through. Yeah, so this tells you that if you have the Thaya environment here on the right side, there's a terminal, new terminal link here. This will open at the bottom a terminal. The top, yeah, you might ask what's the top. The top is just a, you can create here a new file, and this is just a file editor, just like Visual Studio, right? And then you'll see it looks exactly like Visual Studio. I can save it. And if you wanted to open it again, you'll see here it's linked there, but we're not going to use anything with that. And is there a way to, you can actually here open the file browser, and I could delete the file if I wanted to do that again here as well. So you see it functions very much like a regular file editor, right? So, but then with this underlying client terminal environment, and that's what we're going to need here. So if we scroll further down, the thing we do need to install is, well, we have to make sure that it's there, is the IBM Cloud CLI, because we're going to create everything in the cloud, and we're going to use the IBM Cloud here. So if I type IBM Cloud version, you will see that the IBM Cloud CLI here is already pre-installed. So this is version 1.2. So if you wanted to do this, say, on your local machine against your own client terminal on a Mac, you can just follow these instruction sets by running this curl bash pipe, and that will install the installer as well. But I recommend to just use the client terminal at Cognitive Labs. The only thing that we do need to install is the infrastructure service. I skipped the step of installing the Kubernetes service, because if I do IBM Cloud plugin list, I believe it is, it will list all the pre-installed plugins, and the one that's also going to be used today is this Kubernetes service or container service plugin. But that's already installed. So this step, if you wanted to do it locally or outside of this environment, you will need to install the Kubernetes service plugin. And the infrastructure service, which is basically what we're going to do now, that is not installed yet, as you can see from this list. So we're going to install that one for sure, even if you're using the labs at cognitive class. So we do IBM Cloud plugin install, infrastructure plugin. And then let me see what, looking up, am I not, did I do a typo? Maybe try it again. Okay, I must have had a typo. Let me double check. Infrastructure plugin. What did I type? Oh, service. Sorry, it's not the infrastructure plugin. It's the infrastructure service. I was so busy in my head with the plugin that I forgot. So now, if I would browse back up to list my plugins here, then you'll see. Now we should see the infrastructure or the VPC infrastructure plugin here at the bottom. Awesome. We're ready to get started. So with all the pre-requirements already installed, how easy is that? We can start with setting up our environment, and we need to log in to the IBM Cloud. We need to create a cluster. We need to create the virtual private cloud. So we need all that. There's actually a service on the IBM Cloud, and let me scroll up here for the order of steps that we're going to execute. There is a service on the IBM Cloud that has the virtual private cloud generation 2 compute pre-installed with it. So you can execute and set up the IBM Cloud Kubernetes service cluster, and then as well deploy that within a virtual private cloud. And I assume that's going to be deployed through a Terraform script, is what I'm guessing. So that's really handy here. And then next, we're going to deploy the guestbook. We need to do a few things like updating a security group and looking at the load balancer and looking at the application load balancer. So we'll step through those steps here. There's also an option to create your cluster in the cloud through the UI actually. So if I go to IBM Cloud, cloud.ibm.com, there is a catalog, and I think I need to widen this a little bit to see the catalog menu item pop up here at the top. So if I go to catalog and I look for VPC, then it'll preload a few things I don't see. Okay, it's easier if I do it this way on the left side maybe. Let's look for Kubernetes. So if I look for Kubernetes, there's actually, so there it is. See, so if you create a Kubernetes cluster, which you can do for free, you can create a free plan. And that comes with one worker node. And you can just do it here, and then you create it. That's for free. We're going to need a standard plan for Kubernetes, but with VPC. And it says here I need to create a VPC first. So if I would open that in a new window here, yeah, you'll see here that you could step through the steps of creating the virtual private cloud first, create a subnet for it, and create it here. That's everything. And you see it's for free. And yeah, and I think then we'll use let me see. I forgot what it's in the CLI, but we'll see. I'm using the CLI today, so and then we'll use the cluster. The instructions for using it through the UI, so it's right here. You can create a Kubernetes cluster, choose the generation 2, so let me see. So you create a standard, Kubernetes, VPC, and then you need to create a VPC. I already had created, so in the instructions I already created the VPC. And then it'll show up here. And then you'll choose your worker zone and you create it. Now I will do both through the CLI, just because that way I have my instructions to automate everything. So that's my preferred way. I only added a sort of a light UI instructions if you really, really want to go that route, but I prefer not to. Okay. We will really start a little bit up here because we need, before I start, because I write all my commands so that later on you could easily automate it in a script or whatever. So I write all my commands in CLI. So I also use some variables so that in the instructions later on, all you need to do is copy paste. And if you want to change anything in the naming, you need to do it here. So, and the first thing you're going to need to change is to use your own username. The username is used in the naming of the virtual private cloud and the subnet and the public gateway. All those will come installed with creating that virtual private cloud. My username is, and keep it short, because we're using some appending of strings to create different usernames for different resources. So keep it short. In my case, I'm using, what is it, like 9 characters. Keep it under 10 and use your username. The other thing you need to set, this is to log in into your IBM Cloud account from the CLI. So I set my IBM ID. This is the email by which you created your IBM Cloud account and by which you logged into the UI, amongst others. So in my case, this is this account for myself that I'm using. And then to create resources like the virtual private cloud, the cluster, etc., they are created in certain data centers and certain regions in the world. And the region that I will be using is, I recommend you to use the same to follow along so you don't find unexpected different output or anything, is to use US South as well, but it's you're free to choose a different region if you want to. So it's US-South. My VPC name is something we're going to name the virtual private cloud. And you can copy-paste these names into your client terminal, but if you wanted to choose the same bottom naming conventions at least. Let me click this pop-up right here. It has the same annoying pop-ups as the actual Visual Studio. My VPC name is using the username I just mentioned that we set with VPC Gen2 VPC 1. I just, this is sort of a naming that I use, that if you want to create more than one virtual private cloud, you can go up 2, 3, 4. The next thing is the subnet for the virtual private cloud. And this is my VPC underscore subnet underscore name, my VPC subnet name. And there too, I will use my username value dash VPC subnet 1. And the naming is not too important, just keep it a little bit logical. The next one is the name of the public gateway. My underscore public underscore gateway is set to username dash public dash gateway 1. Cluster name, and we'll get through these. It's a little bit tedious maybe, but we'll get through these, and that'll make our lives easier in the remaining of the tutorial. My cluster name is going to be named username value dash IKS 1.8, which is the version 1.18 of the Kubernetes that I'm using with VPC. And this is my cluster 1. Kubernetes service version, which is, like I said already, the 1.18 version of Kubernetes. And then we need to create a namespace, use a namespace for deployment just to keep our resources separate from other deployments on our cluster. I'm going to deploy a guestbook application. And that's it. So this is all the values that were preset. And for the remaining of the tutorial, we can pretty much use the environment variables that we just created. So that's just convenient. And you can, if you can copy paste, go ahead. I will type out everything for people that are typing along with me. So IBM Cloud login -u IBM ID, which should be set to your email on the account. But it defaults to US South in my case. But that might be different for you, depending where in the world you are. And it's authenticating. It's I actually have 2 accounts linked to my IBM ID because I did a workshop that I use resources on another account for. In this case, I choose my personal account, which is my pay-as-you-go account. And I am not sharing statistics, but if you feel strongly you want to, then go ahead. And I'm not going to update my version of the CLI right now. So currently I'm logged in. I'm going to clear my client terminal. And I can tell the IBM Cloud CLI that I'm targeting the region, my region, which is set to US South. It's already by default set to US South, as you can see. You could change default targeting group, where that means where your resources will be created. In this case, it's already set to US South. Optionally, you can create a resource group, or if there's already a resource group, you can target a resource group, but I don't think it's necessary here. The other thing that we do set is we'll tell IBM Cloud Infrastructure plugin that we're targeting the generation 2. I'm assuming, yeah, this generation 2. There's also some older infrastructure that you can target, but we specifically want to use Gen 2 here. And that is just a little bit more updated version of the infrastructure with some different configurations. Let me see. So where are we now? If you wanted to use the UI, which I told you already, I prefer not to. There's some. I might update that to be more complete, but for now, skip that because I really prefer to use the CLI here. So let's create first the virtual private cloud. So here the instructions tell me to create a virtual private cloud, use the infrastructure plugin, and tell it to VPC create. And use my VPC name. And it's creating it, and it's, let me see if I widen this, what information it returns to me. It tells me, first of all, went okay. Oh, actually, that's from before. It tells me it went okay because it gives me back an ID for my virtual private cloud. And it gives me a cloud resource name, a CRN, which is this long namespaced name, this unique reference within the cloud, the resource group, access control lists, network, security groups already assigned here to the virtual private cloud. It created all these already for me, which is pretty neat. And then we could list them out and see what virtual private clouds. This is another way of just checking if it was created successfully. And you see here that there's only one created, which is the one we named, my username, VPC Gen2, VPC1. So that also just confirms that it was created successfully. Next, if you want to retrieve your ID, we already saw it in the log output what it was, and I could copy pasted it and set my VPC ID that way. And if I do that again, list my virtual private clouds, and I get the listing. This is my ID, but I always like to automate as much as I can, so I can also retrieve my virtual private clouds, my VPC ID, and set it as an environment variable, so I can use it later on, and I can retrieve it by the following command, and I do $ parentheses just to interpret the value that I'm being returned. So here's IBM Cloud. This is the actual command to retrieve it. IBM Cloud infrastructure plugin. I list all the VPS, the virtual private clouds we saw, which is just a command we did before, but this time I tell it to output JSON, and I'm only doing that so I can use the bash JQ function to parse JSON and remove the double quotes. And I'm being returned an array. In this case, there's only one virtual private cloud in it, but there could be more. So I'm telling it to use the first virtual private cloud, and with that's not what I'm doing. I'm just pulling out the array, and then I'm telling it to pipe it to a next function, which is to select that item in my array where the name equals, I have to escape the double quotes so it can interpret my variable name, my VPC name. Then I open the double quotes again, single quote to end that name equals, and then close the parentheses. And then I get the correct virtual private cloud in case there would be more. And then I can pipe that and I can retrieve the ID from that correct virtual private cloud. And that's how I set it. So I can execute this. Hope I didn't make a typo. I always double check echoing out that variable name I just created. Yeah, and that's the ID, and you can reference it here above. It's the same ID there, except this time, instead of manually copy-pasting it, I've written it out in a commandable way, so I can automate that if you wanted to. So we have created the virtual private cloud. We retrieved the ID. We need the ID because we need to reference the virtual private cloud when we create a subnet for the virtual private cloud. So now next we're going to create a subnet by saying IBM Cloud infrastructure plugin. Use the subnet-create command to tell it to create a subnet, and then give it a name. So my VPC subnet name, which is a environment variable we set above earlier. We need to create the subnet for my VPC ID. My VPC ID, we just retrieved it with that fancy JQ function, and we create it in the zone for my zone. And then we set the IP version for address count to 256. I forgot what this exactly does. If you're interested, you can just quickly look that up and then enter. Let me see what I did here. Oh, I made a mistake, and I'm guessing. If I'm guessing that the zone might not have been set. So let me echo out what I just did to verify that the zone was set. Okay, you see here, as I was typing it, I was already like, did I set the zone? And I did not, because it's missing its value here. Let me scroll up if we actually do set the zone here above, and I just, yeah, you see, I forgot to type it out here. My subconsciousness was telling me that I had not typed that in. So let's do that now. We set an environment variable, my zone equals, we're using the my region setting, which I know we did set, and I'm just using the first one. So I'm using US South 1 as the zone. I do the -1, I know that exists. It's not a random number that I created, it's a number that I know exists in the IBM Cloud. You can actually look up all the zones that exists with an IBM Cloud function, which I don't know from the top of my head, but it's probably something like IBM Cloud zones, but I forgot exactly, and zones for a particular region, so you have to look it up by region. Now, if I echo out that preview command, you'll see here the zone is set, and that means I can run that command now, and now it should run. Right? So, and then pardon me, I'll do this a few more times where I mistype something and won't reference it. But now at least you'll see the IBM Cloud subnet was created. It has an ID. And here again, I could just manually copy paste it. And go back to the instructions here below. I could manually copy paste it, where I could do copy, and then I could do my VPC subnet ID and then paste it in. I could do that, but let's be neurotic and program this. Let's code this. Everything is code, they say nowadays. And I think that's one of the reasons why I force myself into this discipline. And I recommend you, if you really want to go along with the thinking of everything is code, to actually code out everything. I think that's just behavioral therapy, if you will. But it's a good practice, I think, at the same time, if you want to be get into the groove with that, at least. So IBM Cloud KS subnets is a way to retrieve all my existing subnets, and I can output it to JSON in order to pipe it to a parsing function called JQ, which is a bash function. I removed the quotes that the ID is surrounded by when it returns it to me. I take the array that I got from the previous command, I pipe it to a select function, and I say the name has to equal, use an escape function to interpret the value of my environment variable, which is my VPC subnet name, close, and close the parentheses, and then pipe it so that I can, from that JSON object, get the ID, and close, single quotes, parentheses, to retrieve the my VPC subnet. And I mistyped something again, which I told you would happen many, many times if I don't copy paste. So IBM Cloud KS, IS, there we go, caught it right away. And this is also the disadvantage of being isolated and having no pairwise tell me, Remko, you mistyped. IBM Cloud IS subnets, I'll walk over it anyway. Subnets output, JSON, JQ, and I'm pretty sure the rest was good. Yeah, I don't see any mistakes. So let's run this now again, and let's hope the VPC subnet is retrieved. We can double check by echoing out the value from my VPC subnet ID. It's set, there we go, yippee, and that's that. So we have created a virtual private cloud and a subnet, and the next group, let's look at the security groups. So if I would do IBM Cloud infrastructure plugin VPCS output JSON, yeah, I'll just quickly run this. Then what I would see amongst others, this default group that was created along with my virtual private cloud. And I just need that default security group name and the ID for that security group name. So I need the name in order to retrieve the ID, and I need the ID in order to list out the ID details here, the security group details, and what do I do with it next? It's quite long. And I probably, I'm not using it. Am I not using it anywhere here? Well, we'll see. Doesn't look like it. It looks like I'm just getting it for the heck of it. Yeah, I'm just getting it for the heck of it, it looks like. Well, okay, why not? So, I'm up for that. This is also just a fun, good exercise. If you're sort of a, like an operations engineer, or a DevOps engineer, I don't know what they all came up with it. I think, and what's the Google name for it? The site reliability engineer, and I'll say, whatever you are. This is good, fun practice to get the hang of using these type of commands. So I can retrieve the security group name, set it, and interpret the IBM Cloud Infrastructure Virtual Private Cloud, output it to JSON, pipe it into the JQ function, which parses, remove the resulting double quotes from the value I'm retrieving, get the array. I know there's only one, but if you would have multiple and you wanted to select, I could, for instance, just say, I know this one, so just give me the first. But you never know what people have in their infrastructure. So you can retrieve it by selecting it by name. So that's what I'm doing here. Select a name, which should equal the value that's in my VPC name. Close it, single quotes, close the parentheses, and then pipe that to retrieve, and just use the default JSON dot notation to retrieve the default security group and the property name on the security group. So this way I can get the security group name, I can echo out my default security group name, and it's this is actually a generated name. Added with Prattler Slam cursor, you have something similar to silly name, just like the way Docker uses silly naming for naming containers that were not given a name. Now I have the security group name. I can retrieve the default security. I do think I need it somewhere later. I forgot where it was. I can use the ID for the default security group ID. I think it's later on to get the ID. So let's do that as well. Here I interpret the value for the IBM Cloud IS security groups command. So here I retrieve all the security groups in my account. I output it as JSON. Pipe it to that nice JQ command. And one of the fun things about JQ is that once you get the hang of doing it this way, you'll use that function like a tons. And this is like fun practice, right? So by the time you're done with this tutorial, you'll do this blindfolded. And I'm not even telling you what I'm doing anymore, which I should. So I'm here interpreting with escaping the double quotes because I'm using single quote literals. I need to get back to double quotes and escape it so I can interpret that value in my environment variable, which is my default security name. That is used in the comparison to by name selection. So that's what I'm doing there. Closing the parentheses, and then what I'm looking for is the ID really. You need to debug this when you're typing it. I always do say you just go back and you remove the last command in the pipe. Each horizontal stripe is a pipe that moves the output from the previous command to the next. So you can just remove the last command and see if that works. Remove the last command, see if it works. You'll end up with just that first command very often, and you'll find something wrong, and you'll see that you're not parsing out according to the correct JSON. So that's typically something that would go wrong here. So you can just output the whole JSON object and see what the exact dot notation is you need. So let me double check if my default security ID was output, and there it is. All right, nice. And with that security group ID, I can list the details of my security group ID by saying IBM Cloud Infrastructure Plugin Security Group used at my default security group ID value, and then if I don't output it as JSON, I can just get it sort of in a parsed format. Depends a little bit. Some people find it always easier to use the JSON to read, which you can just parse out here as --output set to JSON. I find it a little bit more because it's nicely nested. I find it a little bit easier this way. So I've set this, I've parsed that out, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to need this later on. I also want to create and attach a public gateway so that we can, so we create a virtual private cloud. That means at that moment we cannot access our cluster. So I want to create a public gateway with a floating IP being assigned in by my subnet. So I can use the domain name reference, send it to the public gateway. The public gateway links it up to the public IP of my cluster, forwards it to my cluster, and then the cluster handles traffic from there on. So that's what I need. That's why I need to. I'm basically opening up my air gap. I'm using quotation marks because there's a few more details to an air gap versus a virtual private cloud. But let's create that gateway, right? So clear for clean working tablet here, and use the IBM Cloud infrastructure plugin to say public gateway create. Use the name that we set right in the beginning, my public gateway, and create it in my VPC ID. The ID to create it, and create it in my zone. It's creating it, returning it, and again I could use the ID, just being lazy and copy paste it. I'm not going to be lazy, I'm going to be disciplined and neurotic probably by saying my public gateway ID equals $, opening parenthesis, using the IBM Cloud IS public gateways, list all my gateways, make sure I get it back as I put it as JSON, pipe it into the JQ command, remove the double quotes, and then what I'm going to do with it is I'm going to take the array that I'm being given back, pipe it into the select command, and say compare, find the item where the name is set to single quotes, escape the double quotes, so I can use environment variable here, my public gateway name, close double quotes, close single quotes, close parenthesis, and give me back the ID for that item, and close single quotes, close parenthesis. I want to double check that that was given back correctly, so my public gateway key is something I need, I got it. What am I doing here? I am getting the subnets. I'm using a different way. I'm getting the subnets, and then I'm looking for the subnet with the name subnet, and within that there is actually a setting for public gateway.id. So this is a different way of retrieving it. Just for the sake of exercise, I don't think it matters. Actually, what I can do quickly is I can check if that will give me the same value back, right? So this is what I typically do. If I want to see the output, I'm guessing that there is a new line misrendered here that makes this interpretable. So, well, okay, so then what I then do, oh wait, did I not copy the whole thing? Is that the issue? Okay. Sometimes the, there's a new line when I was, okay, I guess I'm not, okay, so this is actually empty. See, this is interesting. The way I then often would debug it is I would remove the ID. I would remove the select, and I'm removing the whole JQ actually just to make sure that something is in my subnets. So this is my subnet, and I'm looking for the subnet name, and I know there's only one, but here's the name. And then within this, I'm looking for a public gateway, and there is none. Or did we not create one, or did we not? No, we did create one, but did we not set it correctly? Oh, wait. No. In the next step, I'm updating my subnet, and I'm setting the public gateway ID. Okay, maybe I reversed these commands. That's what it looks like, to be honest. And then the second way is a way to double check that it was set correctly. So that's what it looks like, actually. So I'll see if this is the case, and then I'll update my tutorial. So we have the public gateway already because we created it. And then I can use IBM Cloud IS subnet update my VPC subnet ID, which we retrieved earlier in the tutorial. And I set the public gateway ID that I just created. So that's my public gateway ID. And that. And so now I'm updating my gateway, and you see here that a public gateway was set now. So I think I just must have been in the tutorial reverse the commands. The correct order is to update my subnet with the gateway I just created, and then I can check. I'll actually do this way. Here, if I list all the subnets as JSON, I can now see hopefully let me see what the exact parsing is here. A public gateway, I see it right here. And within the public gateway, there's an ID. Okay, so that means that this is a valid, I'm just validating what I did here. So let me scroll back up to my command there. IBM Cloud ES subnet output, I'm JQing it. And then I'm retrieving the subnet name, I'm retrieving so if I execute this, and I'm not setting it to the environment variable yet, but it shows me at least the value is now no longer null, but it's set. So that just proves what I was doing there. Let's close the parentheses and then set this value to a environment variable. So I'm scrolling all the way back to the beginning of the line. And here I define my variable, my public gateway ID 2, and this is just set as number 2 just to validate. The gateway is retrieved via the subnet now, because that's really where it belongs, and that's the configuration I'm checking here. My public gateway ID 2, but this one is retrieved from the subnet, and now it works. So that's what I was doing there. Another thing that I want to retrieve is my floating IP that was assigned to me by adding the gateway in the subnet. So if I do IBM Cloud Infrastructure and I tell the subnet public gateway to give me the details for the public gateway that is named. Oh, I have to use the VPC subnet ID. At least that's an instruction, but I think it might be another typo, but we'll see. Here I'm half blindly typing out what the tutorial tells me to do, and half thinking if what I'm doing is correct. But we'll find out. Trial and error, that's how we go through life halfway often. So I'm looking for the dot floating IP, specifically for the address value in the JSON. And you could separately the JSON, and we might actually end up doing that, I think. So let's double check. Maybe I was correct in getting the floating IP. It looks to have set it correctly, but just go quickly back to what I wanted to do is I wanted to show you the whole JSON object. So this is a way of just sanity checking or debugging if you ever mess up one of those commands, and this is just an example where I'm not 100% sure if what I did was correctly. So what I'm doing is I retrieve the public gateways, and if I scroll up here, it added floating IP with an address, with an IP address, which is what I was going to retrieve. I also see a href. Yeah, that's not really what I was looking for. Yeah, these are just, so this is what I'm looking. This is a resource type public gateway. The reason why I was doubting is it's like, hey, wait a minute, why am I giving it the subnet ID if I'm looking to retrieve the details for the public gateway? But apparently that's the syntax, because it does give me back the resource type public gateway. And if you ever doubt the syntax, which I often forget, or if I don't want to bother looking for the, and I think I forgot the Y, didn't I, there? Oh. You can just leave out the values and do a -h, and it'll give you back the options that were missing. Here, what it's telling me here is, if I do a little help, it says, here are the details for the public gateway attached to a subnet. And it does tell me that in the usage, I need to give it the subnet ID and not the public gateway ID, which was what I was expecting. I was like, oh, should I give you the public gateway ID? But no, the command was used correctly here. So okay, just sanity checked, sanity, all good, no worries, no panic. Don't call the institution yet. We're good here. All right, so where does that leave us? We now have a VPC, we have a subnet, and we added a public gateway with a floating IP. So I could, theoretically, if I had deployed applications, I could send a request to the public gateway. It's parsing it, forwarding it to the IP, and etc. Into the cluster. So you can also review some of this in your UI. So at this moment, I think it is a nice time to do that, just to look at the UI. I think is often a good way. Say you scripted it all out, you put it in a script, you run it, it goes tick, 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 and after a minute or so, you want to just make sure that everything in your UI looks good. So you could go to, I believe, what is it telling me? VPC infrastructure. You see there's classic infrastructure, which is generation 1, and then there's VPC infrastructure here, and I should open it up to have here a little bit the same view here. And you could go to subnets or VPCs. Here, let's just browse around a little bit. Here to virtual private clouds. This is the listing here. I would expect one virtual private cloud to show up, namely the one we just created. It's not in the Frankfurt region, but it is in the US South, which is Dallas, I believe. So here it is, Remko Dev VPC Gen. If I click it, it has one subnet attached here, you can see in the default resource group. If I click it, I see a few more details. Let me see, it's giving me some IP ranges, some routing tables, some cloud service endpoints, and here is also the subnet in US South or Dallas 1 with a public gateway. And was that the same IP that we got back here? I forgot. 18, yeah, okay, so that looks like the same, right? 169, 48, 169, 48, 155, 118. Okay, so it's the same one. So we'll see, we're not fooled by neither the UI or the CLI, at least they're working in sync. I can also directly access them to the subnets here, to the floating IPs here. See same value here of the floating IP that's attached to my public gateway here. You could, I don't think we have any private endpoints, but you could add private endpoints. Is actually another step in air gapping, sort of a larger deployment, security groups, routing tables, access controls. This all comes with the territory here. So, okay, we're in pretty good shape here, but what we have not done yet on the CLI is basically we have an empty virtual private cloud. So we have not created a cluster yet, and that's really part of the purpose that we are trying to accomplish. So let me take a sip of my water. And clear my environment here, and okay, let's do that. Let's add a cluster to our virtual private cloud. In the IBM Cloud Kubernetes service, KS stands for Kubernetes Service plugin, I can retrieve the zone and list the provider VPC Gen2. So I'm just doing some incorrect usage. ls list KS zone command ls, yes. Is it not with oh sorry, not with a dash, but for the dash provider VPC Gen2. Okay, sorry, my fault. I'm enthusiastic here, and here I see the zones in which I could create a cluster. And let me see what I'm doing here. So I'm adding the zone, and you see here, this is the way to actually check. Remember, I was earlier, we set it to US South 1. This is the way to double check that we are using the right zone value. I previously had just appended the region with 1, and you can see that if you would have chosen Australia, Sydney, or for your region, or Europe, Germany, Europe, Great Britain, Japan, Tokyo, or US East as your region, then setting the region -1 would automatically create that first zone as your zone. So that's what we're just validating here. The other thing we need to validate is the IBM Cloud KS version. So we're listing the versions of Kubernetes that's available on the IBM Cloud. We're using the default 1.118. 1.19 has some syntax upgrades for a few tutorials and plugins that I've worked on, I believe, amongst others. I think the network policy for Calico has a slightly different version, syntax in 1.19. Or you can use OpenShift, which we're using just a free version cluster here. But if you have access to create OpenShift clusters, which are a bit more they have a license fee because they're sort of an enterprise-ready platform that's available throughout cloud providers. So it's very often the default choice for enterprises. The option is there, but I think for this tutorial, I want to keep it as accessible as possible, right? So let's use 1.18. That's all preset in the environment variable, so we don't need to undo anything. So we can just go ahead and say IBM Cloud, use the Kubernetes service plugin KS, cluster create to create a cluster, and I want to use VPC Gen2 as the provider. For the name of my cluster, I set my cluster name, which I think above we set it to something like username, IKS 1.18, 118 as the version, cluster 1. I think that was the cluster name, I believe. The zone was set to my zone. at US South for me, or you choose one of the other ones there. But then it's nice to keep the zones and the virtual private clouds all the same, right? So don't change your zone if you didn't do it earlier. The version is the S version. Flavor is what is meant by flavor is the and I'll show you here what the options are. If I go to the catalog and I look for the Kubernetes service, here Kubernetes service, I could choose a particular configuration. Here it is. So you see here already is like change flavor. The default in the UI is set to 4 CPUs with 16 gigabytes memory. But you could easily change it, and you see that's linked to pricing here. Let me see what's small ones. So these are sort of the smallest flavor, and that's sort of the standard is like 11 cents, yeah, per hour. Let me see what I set it to. I set it to B 2 times 8. So is that here? Is that listed here? B2. Oh, it's not listed in this table. Oh no, wait. This is not the end of the table. Haha. It's actually, I don't see it listed here, so we can filter the table B2. Yeah, so it's actually not listed here, but I bet that if I go back up and I change it to free, now my flavor is 2 times 8. And I believe, I don't think it changed. I believe this was the free version because I'm using one worker. And I'm pretty sure this is the free standard, the free cluster with one worker node. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm making sure that you are using a free Kubernetes cluster within your virtual private cloud. So it doesn't cost you anything to do this tutorial. Okay, so where is my client terminal again? It's right here. We were at, oh, what did I tell you? What did I do wrong? What did I do here again? Yeah, that's the wrong click. I often do that. So the flavor is set to BX2, but to X8. I'm only using one worker, yeah, just to make sure you have a free cluster account. The VPC ID, my VPC ID, and the subnet for my cluster. So that's subnet ID. So what this does is it creates a cluster with the smallest number of worker nodes, with the smallest configuration, so it's free, and it's creating this within the virtual private cloud and the subnet that I just created. So that way it's secured there. And I just need to type out my VPC subnet ID. Let's hope it'll give me back a new cluster in a bit. And one way to check while it's doing that, you can actually go to IBM Cloud here on the top here again. Here at the bottom, view all. Here's my resources. You'll see now that there is this virtual private cloud with, I forgot if this was the subnet, I believe, or security group, yeah. So then the cluster was also created there, I saw, and it's being deployed as we speak. So let's take a look at the details here. I can open it up a little bit. This will actually take a bit because it'll, And you see here, for instance, it says, if your cluster runs version 18, which, yeah, guilty as charged, the default security group must be edited to allow incoming network traffic from the VPC load balancer. And that's what we'll do in the next step. But it gives me this warning already here. It tells me it's being created with one worker node. It's not up yet. It's being deployed. Let me see. It's preparing the master and the workers here on top, it says. But I do see that's in the zone, US South. It's in the VPC Gen2 infrastructure. It did everything I wanted it to do. The public endpoint URL and endpoint service is still being created. So we're all waiting for that. If we look at the worker nodes configurations, it tells me it was this smallest configuration settings, and yeah, well, we just have to wait. Added the subnet here already, or the ID, the ID at least that needs. So this is a matter of just waiting until that finishes. And oh, I could, go back to the URL once more, sorry. You could also, from the drop down, you can either go to the dashboard or the resource list. I like the resource list, it's my preferred view, but you could also go to Kubernetes. Then you'll see all your Kubernetes clusters listed here. You'll see access to a private registry built in, to a Helm catalog built in. And this, I will say that one of the really nice things about the IBM catalog is actually it's using these public Helm charts and in combination with Terraform to deploy all these services. So it's like a one-click deploy. It does a lot of configuration for you and setup. It's really super nice. You could add Istio to it, for instance. Let me see if I see a few other really quick ones that I really like. Well, it's just the list is so long, it's sometimes hard to find what you're looking for if you not really have anything particular in mind to look for. But Aqua is like security, scanning, Tomcat, Jenkins if you want to use Jenkins, or Knative, MariaDB for MySQL, Portworx if you're looking for generic storage. Redis, Popular Sysdig for monitoring your cluster, Tecton pipelines for modern cross-platform pipelines, auto-scaling, block storage. Oh my God, there's no end to it. All right, so all via Helm charts, pretty nice. But let's go back to the matter at hand. Let's not get distracted here. It's so easy to get distracted with these things, so much good stuff around. Okay, so via the CLI, we could do the same what we did before. IBM Cloud KS clusters to list all the clusters in our environment. It's still deploying, says here. It's still being deployed, but we already get the cluster back, and we can already get the ID, I assume. So we can already set my cluster ID by taking the value of the command IBM Cloud KS clusters. I put it as JSON for the provider VPC Gen2 because it's separate from if you just use without VPC, you get like a different list back. And then you parse, say if you have multiple clusters deployed in your virtual private cloud, parse that list with JQ-R. And with the array that we get back, we pipe it to a select. So we can do a name filtering, escape the double quote so I can use the environment variables value for cluster name. Close the double quote, close the single quote, close the parenthesis. And with the object that I get back, give me the ID because that's the cluster ID that I am looking for. And to double check, echo my cluster ID. That's my cluster ID. That's great, wonderful. It's still running, So we have to wait for that, but the next step, we already logged into our IBM Cloud account because we're executing all these commands. The next step is to connect and create a session to connect to our cluster. And we can do that by pulling back and pulling down the cluster configuration. Yeah, so I'm just getting my clusters back to make sure if the status has already changed. It's still deploying, which is also what you see if I go back to my resource list, go to my cluster here. And there's a lot to setting up a Kubernetes cluster, you know, so it's like no surprise that we have to wait a little bit for this. Maybe for the tutorial, we'll cut some time out, but I don't think so. I think it'll be available in a bit. You can just take a sip, go to the bathroom. Might not even take that long. Let's see, in the meantime, it's still deploying. It would allow me already, maybe it does allow me already to get the cluster config, even though I doubt it, because once we start running kubectl commands, we're basically hitting the API server of the cluster. So that one, the next one will certainly not work yet. But this one might work. We might get back the cluster configuration for my cluster ID. My bet is that, I'm not exactly sure where it's pulling it from, but my bet is that it's IBM Cloud CLI will pull it from the API server on the Kubernetes cluster. So, and that's here. That's what happens here. It's not giving it back to me yet. So we have to wait. I have to be patient. That's fair enough. I can explain to you what we're basically doing. We're trying to deploy. All right, did we update? Don't we have to update the security group first? I think we can do that already. Yeah, because yeah. So, well, the tutorial is this may be good to explain a little bit. The tutorial is now next going to deploy the Kubernetes cluster, the guestbook to the Kubernetes cluster, and it's letting you, it looks like, but because we're doing it directly connected to the cluster on the IBM Cloud, and we're sort of connected to the IBM Cloud, and we're kind of in the virtual private cloud, if you will. We have access to it through the admin cloud provider. But what it doesn't let me is to try and run this curl command to hit the cluster directly to the external IP. And let me see where the external IP comes from. It comes from the service, which is of type load balancer. So that means there is a public, the cluster is up. A application load balancer is sitting there, and in a normal cluster deployment, I would now get the IP address, the external IP address of the load balancer and of the load balancer service, and I would be able to send commands through the load balancer's external IP that was created from the floating IPs of the subnet that's attached to the cluster. But what I did here is I wrapped my cluster around a virtual private cloud. So when I then try to use that external IP, it's wrapped around the virtual private cloud. And the virtual private cloud is telling me you cannot access it. So it's giving me an empty reply back. Here on the right, you already see that there's a warning there in the creation of my Kubernetes cluster. It says, if your cluster runs Kubernetes version 118, the default security group needs to be updated in order to allow incoming network traffic. So you put the two together, you're like, oh, and that's what's happening. And that is what we will do in the step afterwards. We could do this already if I was impatient to wait for my Kubernetes cluster to finish getting provisions set up, etc., with everything attached to it. And maybe I will get impatient. Let's see how long I can still hold out. But if we wait, then the next step, we could update the security group rule, and we could add an inbound rule to allow the port on the node port that the service was deployed at, yeah, that the load balancer is accessible under. If I send that, then yeah. So here are the rules. You can list the rules, and then next I will run that command. It then should allow me to access my application, if anything, through the domain name of the VPC gateway. So, and then here's some information about the load balancer. We'll get to that as well. So in the meantime, I do see that the status of my cluster was is slightly changed. It's not finished yet, but it's finalizing the workers now. So it won't be long anymore now, I hope. So just a little bit more patience before it'll switch to done. But that's sort of what's going to be done. So it's kind of a nice exercise to deploy the application and then try to access it. See, it doesn't work because the VPC is working. And then we'll add the incoming traffic rule. I think we were here, right? Yeah, okay. Yeah, something's changing. Some different status. Oh, so we're going to see what happened here. CLI. Still pending. And this is about a normal time for the clusters to get provisions. You can imagine this: the virtual machine needs to be created, like an operating system needs to be deployed. The cluster, the Kubernetes needs to be deployed. Needs to be administration configuration needs to be set on the cluster. There needs to, like especially on the IBM Cloud, there's like by default, there's some load balancers added. In this case, I also added some a VPC and a subnet. So you can imagine it's quite a bit of an infrastructure exercise here. And let's just wait. We waited so long already, so we might as well wait a little bit. I'm thinking if I could, yeah, one thing that I could, while we wait, can point you to is this fellow. If you go to my username, remkodev.github.io/Kubernetes-networking, and I will port this pretty soon to ibm.github.io/Kubernetes networking, but probably next week or so. But in the meantime, it's available through here. There is a little bit of information about Kubernetes networking. And you see here, actually, the same tutorial that I did on Medium is also available here. If I open it all the way up, you'll have a nice little view. So this is sort of a more elaborate tutorial on Kubernetes networking. It talks about the creating of services and service resources on Kubernetes and what that means, for traffic control, cluster IP, node ports, load balancer, which is actually, this is the load balancer we will use for our guestbook application. It also goes a little bit to talk about ingress and application load balancers, and even it'll go and talk a bit. It's all a bit of like get started with networking lab, but it also talks about network policy, and on the IBM Cloud that means Calico network policy implementations, because Calico is the plugin that implements the CNI on IBM Cloud. So you'll see. So this is another way of additional security layer to control traffic. And you would, by default, if I scroll down, you would start with a zero trust network model, and this just steps you through how to control it. But basically, you would always start with this network policy, which says you cannot access anything from anywhere. And at that moment, you have sort of a application level isolation of your deployments, although this network policy is per namespace. So if you want to do it per cluster, you need to set the global network policy to this policy. But then the next step here, like these exercises will step you through it, you will be telling it that if you have deployed a Hello World application with the correct labeling, because this all works through label selectors, then you can say allow incoming traffic ingress where the labels are targeting the app.hello world. And at that moment, all incoming traffic that matches the target to be Hello World app will be allowed at that moment. And this is a way to allow incoming traffic per namespace, per application. And this is another level of security on top of the virtual private cloud that we are trying to accomplish. In the meantime, we see some change already. We see the worker node is normal. And let's see if that means it's still finalizing the worker nodes. So I'm not sure what exactly it's doing, if it's just an update. Let me see if I refresh the page. Still doing a bit of finalization, but I think we might be able to start and see if we can move on in our tutorial. Anyway, so it's worthwhile taking a look at these this workshop as well. So again, that's remkoh.github.io/Kubernetes-networking, and that will get you there as well. Okay, let's see. Let's get back to the CLI, our beloved CLI. Look how pretty, how wonderful. And hopefully we'll get a good status back. Status is normal. Okay, that's what we would like to see. And let's see if we can then get the IBM Cloud cluster config for our cluster, -- cluster, with the name, my cluster name. Let's see what it gives us back here. Or maybe it's still waiting for the last few finalizations. Oh, it says, okay, the configuration was downloaded successfully. And you might wonder, what is it downloading exactly? So it's downloading it to your home directory /.bluemix. So if I do an ls-al, my home directory as Bluemix, you'll see here config JSON. And if I would do a cat home directory dot Bluemix config JSON, this is what it downloaded. Basically, you see here some IAM tokens. This is the authentication method on Kubernetes clusters. So when you send a request to IBM, every request to your cluster goes through this API server chain of functions: authentication, authorization, and admission controllers. And one of the first things it does is it checks the certificates, if that's set correctly. But it also looks at the tokens. And you can, when you set up your cluster, you can set how exactly it's authenticating. In this case, it's using these IAM tokens. Yeah, so that's what it does there. Let me clear it up. And then lastly, it goes to admission controls and checks like network policies and whatever. And that's like every request except I think read requests. They don't go through the whole admission controller, not all of them, I believe at least. So we can check in that object that we just got back, which is the config object. There is a properties set to current context, and that's what this shortcut is telling us. kubectl config current context. This will give me back a name ID combination, and that's the name ID that we set, because if I do echo my cluster name And I think we got the cluster ID, if I'm not mistaken. You see the same string. So this way we know that now my current session, my current context is set to the cluster we just created. And if you want to switch, because you have multiple clusters, you can set the current context. All right, deploy the guestbook application. We're using the kubectl, which is the Kubernetes client. It translates all your requests to REST API requests. And we are sending a create request on the object, on the resource namespace. And we are asking it to create it with the namespace. This request is sent to the API server. It's upon authentication or authorization and admission, it is sent to the to update the etcd database. The etcd database is then being checked by controllers. The controller's COO or namespace is desired to be created, but it's not created yet. Let's schedule the creation. Schedules the creation. There you go. Kubernetes workflow in a nutshell. Repeat, repeat, repeat. This iterative workflow. Let's go, create it. Wonderful. kubectl create a deployment. And we create a deployment called guestbook. And we're setting the name of the image to an image in the Docker Hub. Under the IBM Com organization, there's an image guestbook with a tag version 1, and we are deploying it to a namespace, my namespace, which we have just created. So that created the guestbook. If I would go to my cluster here, and I would open this dashboard, it will open the Kubernetes dashboard, which is an open source project. It's like available through the IBM ID here. It proxies this request through the, you'll see here, through the domain name proxy to the right cluster. That's why it loads up a little bit. It's being all redirected and reloaded. And then what we change here at the bottom, we should see, first of all, we should see a namespace that we just created, my guestbook. Wonderful. And we should see a deployment guestbook. And apparently this guestbook has one instance, a replica set with definition set for one pod, and that's correct. You could actually update this, so I'm not sure if was it done here. You could scale it up to say, can we create 3 pods? And now it will create the additional pods, new instances, because we currently only have a deployment on pods, so we currently cannot access these because there's no discovery of where these pods are located. Kubernetes might put them up and take them down. It actually took it down again because our deployment has been set to 1. So I think we need to scale it in the deployment to make that work, not in the lower object. So then, because otherwise it autocorrects itself. If I add additional pods, Kubernetes adds new pods to the etcd database, but then it checks the deployment configuration and says, no, it has to be 1, and takes down the pods again. So it's like this self-healing, which I wasn't thinking when I was doing it. I should have done it on the deployment. And you see now it's self-healing in the correct way, namely that it adds these additional pods. And now the traffic can go to either one of these pods. Each of those pods will have its own namespace and IP address. So Linux namespace, I should say, and IP address that makes it an isolated application at the container level. So next we need to add a service to allow service discovery of the deployments. And that's what we'll do here. This might all be too much information for this tutorial, but I'll just throw it out there for you. We're exposing the deployment. This will create a service. And we're referencing the guestbook deployment, and we're exposing it by adding a service type load balancer. And I happen to know that the port is the port of the containers is set to 3000, and in the so that's the exposed, and the Docker file has an expose command set to 3000. I know the application itself is running on 3000, so target port, I should say. Yeah, so my service is exposing 3000, it's forwarding to port 3000, and don't forget in my namespace, otherwise it cannot find the deployment in the namespace. Guestbook expose. Now if I do a kubectl get svc for shorthand for service in my namespace, I will see a load balancer type, cluster IP, the external IP. This is something I should mention here. We created a free cluster, and I don't think the load balancer is actually available on a free cluster. So I doubt this will be created. Yeah, it's not being created. But the port is being created, the node port is being created, so that's available. That is because the configuration we choose, we do not own the subnet of that configuration. We own the other subnet on the virtual private cloud, but we don't own the subnet of the cluster, which was created for the free cluster. I think that's what's here at hand, and you can find that in the documentation. So we don't control the floating IPs, therefore. So therefore, we are not given an external IP. Shouldn't impact us too much, except I am looking for, if I go to overview, yeah, I was looking here for the domain names, the ingress names here, the ingress meshes. So this has not been created yet. So this is still creating, and I'm actually not sure if this will work. We'll see, because I think this might be pending for the same reason. And when I did the tutorial, it for some reason did work, but I'm not sure what exactly will happen next. We'll find out. Okay, so we created a load balancer service. It's actually not giving, it won't be giving me the external IP. So last time I did this, it actually gave me, as you can see here in the output, here, it gave me back as the external IP the ingress, the endpoint here. And either this is still being created, or it will not create it because we only have one worker node with a free cluster. So this might be a little bit of a glitch in our tutorial. We'll find out, or it's still being created, and we'll get lucky there. But it does mean this next check will not work, and that means I'm just going to skip it for now. I am able to extract the node port, so I will set the node port. You'll see here it's 30,051, so I will be able to get the node port. That I will do, and then I'll just check later if it finishes creating that ingress domain. Here we go, node port, $, kubectl get svc, get the service in my namespace. Give me back. I should say guestbook, because that's the name of my service that I'm looking for in my namespace. I'll update the tutorial. Give me back the JSON. Pipe it to JQ-R. The JSON will have an array of items. I will ask it, so it's like a regular JSON object with an array of items underneath. I ask it to give me the spec. I will ask for the ports array, And this will probably require some debugging here, because if I get back an array, I'm not sure if I'm able to get the node port. But let me check. That's probably missing a 0, I'm thinking. Single quotes. So there's an error, cannot iterate over null. So I'm going to check the JSON object and make sure that's in sync with the parsing that I'm setting there. So first get the JSON object back, and this will also allow you to see what I'm doing there exactly. So I'm getting back a JSON object. Yeah, I scroll down, looking for spec objects, and I don't see an array of items. So I think I'm good. Going back here directly to .spec, and in the .spec I have a ports array, and you see there's only one object in that ports array, so I was correct to say this requires 0, and then I don't need to pipe it either. I can just directly get the port back. So this is what I think I need to do to get the SVC port, and I do echo SVC node port, and that's set correctly. So yeah, so this I need to scroll back, just update the tutorial. Why not? We can. We're not updating the security group yet, but here is where I can update the node port. Yeah, so now the SVC node port is doing this correctly. So at least that will be fixed. Then there's also the regular port, so let's check that. And that's the container port, basically. And the value that I'm retrieving from the command is kubectl get svc. Same thing, I need to get the guestbook. I guess the items list comes from the fact that I forgot to include the name in the earlier commands, but we're fixing that now by adding the guestbook name. And then in the namespace, we can set the output to JSON. And then we need to fix the parsing there as well, but we basically do jq-r, and we basically do exactly the same as we did before, namely .spec, .ports. We know it's only one object there, so we can get that first object, and we get the port instead of the node port. And this is way of getting that port, and we can get the port there. Oh, did I not get it? Oh, SVC port, sorry. SVC port, and that's 3000. So I'll update that there as well. Save and publish. Let's go back to where we were. I just already passed it, so. There you go. That's where we are. So we now have the port, the node port. I can double, not here, but I can double check if it's gave. Oh, sorry. See, it's actually the Ingress message is updating. So it's still waiting to finish. What's interesting about is what's to mention here is that the cluster is ready. But in parallel with creating a cluster, IBM Cloud is creating an Ingress resource with an application load balancer, and that, am I saying this correctly? Yeah, and that's created in parallel. So it's kind of like independently of the cluster, the external load balancer is created. And that's basically what this is waiting for. So we have to wait for that as well, even though we could get a little bit further along as before. We still have to wait for this Ingress subdomain to finish, because that'll for this test at least, and maybe I'll skip that test for now, and you can do it separately. But if you wanted to do something like here, where I get the service back and I get the external IP back in a normal, if you have like a multi-worker node environment, the floating IP will be able to be assigned, and you'll get an actual IP address back. In this case, the deployment on IBM Cloud is smart enough to know that because I chose a free cluster with a single worker node, I don't really own that LB, so it doesn't give me floating IPs that I can freely manage and distribute, which I need to do for a load balancer service. But instead, it's smart enough and kind enough to give me the Ingress subdomain as the external IP. So functionally, I kind of don't notice the difference. And this is actually the same principle that will happen when I create a VPC gateway, where the floating IPs on my subnet might change, and I don't want to expose those either. So it creates a subdomain for my VPC public gateway as well, and then it forwards it to the subnet's IP. And that's basically the same principle happens here, and we just have to wait for this parallel creation that's sort of independently running from the creation of the cluster. I'll wait testing this until this is done, but in the meantime, I'm going to ask you to trust me that that's what will happen, that if we currently would now run this external IP, which is using this Ingress domain name, with the port, it would not give me anything back, because my VPC is telling me, I don't accept traffic. What are you talking about? I have no rules that allow incoming traffic. So currently, I cannot access my deployments. I could try once via the CLI if the external IP is ready, maybe, but I don't think so. So it's easier if I do not use the output JSON, because it gives me less information back, actually. Oh, wait a minute. So the external IP is ready. So we're lucky. So see, if you talk long enough, you'll get there. I could go into politics with that, I guess. So let's. Do I still have it in my memory, in my history? Let me check. Create namespace, expose deployment, service namespace. I never typed the full command, but let's do that now. So we set the service underscore external IP environment variable to the response value for the command ucl get svc -n my namespace and what the parameter. No. Where were we? A bit up. In my namespace, and output it as JSON. Pipe it to a JQ. I have to write that man a little thank you for creating JQ. It's excellent. And okay, I'm going to have to update that because it's going to have the same issue as before. I forgot the name here, didn't I? Get SVC textbook. Okay, I'll update that before we're done with this tutorial. So I get the guestbook back. Then I get the JQ function piped. I get the .spec, but ports. I go up here and see, I actually need this little status load balancer, which is at the same level of the spec. So it's actually not the spec, it's status, but load balancer. Make sure I don't make any typos there. Ingress. And ingress gives me an array, but there's only one object in there, so I can just use 0. It's not totally fault proof here if I do this, but I'm gonna cross my fingers that it'll work. And within that, I'm using the host name, and that will give me the external IP. Let me see if there's not another field that I'm missing. No. So that's what I can use. I need to then just single quote close to close the dot reference for the JQ, and then I need to close the parenthesis for the variable, and then I can see by echo VPC external IP. Does that give me back what I want? It does. I'll just remember to fix that in a bit. And then I should be able, if there wasn't a VPC running, I would be able to, I know the application is deployed in HTTP, I know, SVC, external IP, with the SVC port, empty reply from server. And I believe this should not be, should be a node port. I don't think so. Or maybe it is actually, because it's rejecting. I'll double check that. It might be the node port that we need to use there. Now, this just confirms, and sorry for that, this was such an elaborate confirmation of something we knew would be failing. This confirms that there's currently no rules defined that allow incoming traffic on my virtual private cloud. So that's what we need to do, and we can do that by updating the security group, the default security group in our virtual private cloud. So the way we do that is by saying IBM Cloud IS security group rule add. I'm telling it's a profession to come up with these commands. And we already had retrieved my default security group ID. Remember, I was wondering what do we need this for again? Here's where we do. And we're defining an inbound rule, TCP, where we say the port minimum that we're going to allow is SVC port, node port. See, we need the node port. And I don't want to open a range of ports. I only want to open the port for that particular service, and therefore I set the max to equal the minimum, which is also set to SVC node port. And so created a rule that allows traffic on the port that we deployed our load balancer service in, which was 30,051. We can then do an IBM Cloud IS security group rules listing for my default security group ID. And that should then list, let me see what it's exactly listing, some default rules defined. But what I'm particularly interested in is this lat inbound rule, where I say that's allowed. Yeah. So that's my custom rule. And we can try again. Oh, you never know. Or am I using the port here? Sorry. And this is actually the, so this works now. This is actually the HTML page of my guestbook application. So if I would echo out, this application, and I would open in the browser here. There we go, voila, my guestbook application is now running. Say hello. Hello world, blah, blah, blah. It's great. The tutorial works. It says here that's the most important thing, so it is. We started securing our cluster. There's here a little bit more information. For time's sake, I will not go into. You can read through the further information. Talks a little bit more about the load balancer that's added here. The Ingress application load balancer. I said a few things around it already. The other thing to note maybe here is that it's using Nginx on IBM Cloud Kubernetes. It has a little bit more information here listed. And in addition, there's also a virtual private cloud load balancer that was created. So it's worth reading into this a little bit more if you want to get into the load balancing aspect, which is part of the security and resilience of your application as well. There's a few more administrative functions you can dive into there. And there's also, you see here, for instance, I mentioned I manually copy paste some IDs in there because I'm just demonstrating the use of a few things here. Yeah, that's it. And this is some cleanup instructions, which I'll do outside of the tutorial. The only other thing that we can demonstrate in addition to what we just did is that if I would list the rules here, and if I was going to try and delete this, so I did that H, and I'm looking for a security group delete or SGD. Yeah, so I could SGD for short. I could likely this asks me to delete security. Oh wait, I don't want to create. That's not what I want to do. I want to delete the rule, so not the whole security group. It says security delete. So SG rule D. That's what I want to do, and SG. Rule D, wonderful naming. And if I ask help, I'm just going to ask, I need to provide the group and the rule ID. Yeah, so let's do that. This is the default SG ID, and if I list the rules, I can just copy paste this rule ID here. So if I remember correctly, this was IBM Cloud IS SG rule D. That's the security group ID, and then the rule ID. This would delete the rule ID, I hope. This will delete security group rule. Yes, that's what I want. And then if I would go back to my guestbook application, I try to reload. And what I'm expecting here is that this is no longer working. And you see it, little rotating waiting sign there. It's no longer responding, allowing my traffic, so the page isn't working anymore. And that's exactly what we want to accomplish with Virtual Private Cloud and the rules that you can add to it. All right, awesome, good, great, wonderful. Thank you for joining. If you have any questions, reach out to us. You'll find us. Reach out for my GitHub, on my LinkedIn, all my social media. Here, I'll prove it to you. Is on Remko H Dev. So here's my LinkedIn, REMKOHDEV. That's my LinkedIn. You change this to Twitter, to Facebook, to Dev2, whatever, Instagram, you'll find me, and we'll talk, and hopefully you'll zoom in further. I'm coming up with more tutorials on security, networking, storage, a little bit more advanced topics than from the get started. So stay tuned, come back, more to come. Enjoy.